A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. What do a blockchain-powered toothbrush, an AI that predicts your dog's mood, and a subscription service for bottled air have in common? They all raised millions of dollars before vanishing into the startup graveyard. Today's prompt from Daniel is about 10 delightfully ridiculous flash-in-the-pan startups that either never got going or went bust in spectacular fashion.
Herman Popplebear here. This is a fantastic prompt because we are currently living through a period in 2026 where the venture capital world is finally cooling off from the AI gold rush, and we're seeing these same patterns repeat. It is the perfect time to look back at the wreckage of the last decade to see what we can learn. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash.
It is funny you mention the AI gold rush, because some of these older failures feel remarkably modern in their hubris. We are going to look at some case studies in misreading markets, over-engineering solutions, and essentially ignoring basic human needs in favor of disruption. Herman, what's our first victim on the slab?
We have to start with the king of Silicon Valley excess, Juicero. This was a company that raised $120 million from top-tier investors like Google Ventures. The product was a $700 Wi-Fi connected juicer that used proprietary produce packs.
I remember this one. It looked like a stormtrooper's lunchbox, and the whole pitch was that it applied 4 tons of pressure, enough to lift 2 Teslas, to squeeze these bags of organic pulp.
That is the technical absurdity of it. They spent years and millions on research and development to create a custom-engineered press. But then, a Bloomberg reporter discovered that you could just squeeze the bags with your bare hands and get the same amount of juice in roughly the same amount of time.
That is the ultimate solution, looking for a problem, moment. You have engineers obsessing over the mechanical stress of a custom-milled aluminum press, while a human hand provides perfectly adequate torque for free. Did the Wi-Fi at least do something useful?
It checked the expiration date on the bag. If the bag was expired, the machine would refuse to squeeze it. It was essentially a DRM-protected juice box. This is a classic example of over-engineering, a simple process until it becomes a burden. They forgot that the user experience of squeezing a bag is already solved by nature.
But wait, how did the investors not see this coming? If you're Google Ventures, aren't you doing a squeeze test before you hand over millions?
You would think so, but they were sold on the platform play. The idea wasn't just the juice, it was the data and the subscription model. They wanted to be the Nespresso of juice. In the VC world, if you can convince someone you're a platform rather than a product, the valuation triples. They ignored the hardware reality because the software potential looks so shiny on a spreadsheet.
It is also a lesson in unit economics. They eventually dropped the price to $400, but they were still losing money on every unit. When the hand squeeze video went viral, the brand became a laughingstock overnight. It is hard to recover when your high-tech disruptor is beaten by a thumb and a forefinger.
Think about the waste involved. Every single one of those machines contained high-grade aircraft aluminum and custom circuit boards. All of that carbon footprint just to replace a task that takes 30 seconds of manual labor. It's the definition of Silicon Valley myopia, the belief that if you add a chip to it, it becomes inherently more valuable.
Moving from over-engineered hardware to overfunded software, let's talk about Klinkle. This was a mobile payments app founded by a 23-year-old Stanford grad named Lucas Duplin. In 2013, he raised over $30 million without even having a functional product.
$30 million for a ghost app? That is impressive even by today's standards. What was the secret sauce supposed to be?
That was the problem. No one knew. It was shrouded in mystery. They had a massive office in San Francisco, and reports came out that they spent $2 million on a launch party and high-end perks before they even had a beta. The culture was apparently toxic, and they kept pivoting the technology behind the payments. At one point, they were using high-frequency ultrasound to transmit payment data between phones.
Ultrasound? Because clicking a button or using near-field communication was too mainstream? How does that even work in a loud environment?
It basically doesn't. Imagine trying to pay for a coffee in a crowded cafe while the espresso machine is steaming and people are shouting orders. The microphone on the merchant's phone couldn't pick up the secret sound from the customer's phone. Here was a classic Rube Goldberg solution. They were trying to bypass the hardware limitations of the time, but it was incredibly finicky.
But why ultrasound? Was there a technical reason, or were they just trying to be different?
The pitch was that it didn't require specialized NFC chips, which many phones lacked in 2013. But they ignored the fact that sound is an incredibly unreliable data medium. It's susceptible to echoes, ambient noise, and even the physical orientation of the phone. They spent millions trying to solve the physics of sound when they could have just waited for Apple and Google to standardize NFC, which they did about 18 months later.
It sounds like they were trying to invent a new physics just to avoid paying a small fee to Visa or MasterCard.
Eventually, the talent started fleeing, and the company burned through the cash without ever reaching a meaningful launch. It is a textbook case of pedigree over product. Investors saw a young Stanford kid and assumed he was the next Mark Zuckerberg, ignoring the fact that there was no actual utility being built.
It is that founder worship that gets people every time. If you have the right vest and the right degree, people will throw money at you until you prove you cannot handle it. Speaking of things people could not handle, let's look at Quirky.
Quirky was actually a really cool concept on paper. It was a social invention platform where people could submit ideas for products, the community would vote on them, and Quirky would manufacture and sell the winners. They raised $185 million.
I actually liked some of their stuff. They had that flexible power strip called pivot power. It was legitimately useful. So what went wrong?
The unit economics were a disaster. Because they were trying to launch a new consumer hardware product every single week, they could not achieve any economies of scale. They were overpromising on manufacturing and taking on all the inventory risk. If a product flopped, Quirky was stuck with the bill. They ignored the reality of supply chains in favor of a move fast and break things mentality that just does not work when you are dealing with physical atoms instead of digital bits.
But didn't they have a partnership with GE? I remember seeing their logo on a bunch of smart home stuff.
They did, but even GE couldn't save them from the long tail of bad ideas. For every pivot power, there were 10 products like a specialized egg separator or a weird citrus sprayer that only 500 people actually wanted. In hardware, you need a hit to pay for all the R&D of the misses, but Quirky was trying to be a hit factory for everything at once.
How did they manage the quality control? If you're launching a new product every week, you can't possibly be doing rigorous safety testing, right?
You hit the nail on the head. Their return rates were astronomical. When you rush a product from a napkin sketch to a Best Buy shelf in 90 days, things break. They had a smart air conditioner called Eros that was plagued by connectivity issues. Because they were spread so thin across 100 different product categories, they didn't have the engineering depth to fix any of them. They were a mile wide and an inch deep.
So they were basically a giant laboratory that forgot it was also supposed to be a store. It is the danger of crowdsourcing everything. The crowd might love a niche product, but that does not mean 1 million people will buy it at a price that covers the tooling costs in China.
And that brings us to the second segment of our list, where we look at startups that failed not just because of bad engineering, but because they fundamentally misread human behavior or legal boundaries. Let's talk about Aereo.
Ah, the one weird trick of the broadcast world.
Aereo was a service that allowed you to stream over-the-air television on your phone or computer. To get around copyright laws, they built massive data centers filled with thousands of tiny, dime-sized antennas. Each subscriber rented their own individual antenna.
It was such a cheeky legal loophole. Because the law said an individual can record TV for personal use, they argued that they were just providing the equipment for you to do it remotely.
It was brilliant from a technical legal standpoint, but it was a direct assault on the retransmission fees that big broadcasters rely on. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2014. The court basically said, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a cable company, it's a cable company, regardless of your tiny antennas. They ruled it illegal, and Aereo was dead within weeks.
But why didn't they just pivot to being a legitimate streaming service? They already had the user base.
Because their entire business model was predicated on not paying the fees. Once the Supreme Court said they had to pay like everyone else, their margins vanished. They didn't have the capital to compete with Comcast or Spectrum on their own turf. It's a reminder that a legal hack isn't a business plan.
Did they really think the Supreme Court would care about the technicality of the individual antenna?
They did. Their lawyers argued that if Aereo was illegal, then the entire concept of the cloud was illegal. They tried to frame it as a threat to all remote storage, but the justices saw right through it. Justice Breyer famously compared it to a valet service that claims it isn't a parking lot because each car is in a separate individual space. The court doesn't like it when you try to outsmart the spirit of the law with a clever gadget.
That is a recurring theme. You can't just disrupt your way out of federal law if you don't have the lobbying power to back it up. Uber did it by being too big to fail before the regulators caught up. Aereo just wasn't big enough yet.
Now, let's shift to a social failure. Yik yak. This was the anonymous social media app that took college campuses by storm in 2014. At its peak, it was valued at $400 million.
I remember Yik Yak being the most toxic place on the internet for about 6 months. It was like a localized version of the worst parts of Reddit.
That was the problem. The feature was anonymity based on geographic location. It was great for finding out where the free pizza was on campus, but it was a nightmare for bullying and harassment. Because there was no accountability, it became a tool for bomb threats and hate speech. They tried to fix it by forcing users to create handles and profiles, which ended the anonymity.
And once you take the anonymity out of an anonymous app, you're just left with a worse version of Twitter. But didn't they try to pivot into a local discovery app?
They did, but the brand was already poisoned. Parents hated it, school boards banned it from their Wi-Fi networks, and once the edginess was gone, the college kids moved on to Snapchat. Users fled immediately. They misread the value of their own product. The value wasn't the location, it was the ability to say things without consequences. When they tried to make it safe for advertisers and investors, they killed the very thing that made it popular. It went from a $400 million valuation to being sold for scraps to Square in 2017.
It's a fascinating case of unintended consequences. They thought they were building a digital bulletin board. They ended up building a digital burn book. Was there any way to moderate a location-based anonymous app without killing the vibe?
Probably not with the technology of 2014. You would need a massive army of human moderators or very sophisticated AI, which wasn't ready yet to catch the nuance of campus-specific bullying. If someone posts, "The girl in the red sweater in the library is a thief," a global moderator doesn't know who that is, but everyone on that campus does. The hyperlocality made the harassment more intimate and more damaging.
It is the anonymity paradox. You need it to grow, but it makes you unmonetizable and radioactive to the general public. It is a hard needle to thread.
Speaking of radioactive, let's talk about people. This was famously dubbed the Yelp for people. The idea was that you could rate any human being on a 5-star scale, your ex-boyfriend, your boss, your neighbor, whether they wanted to be on the app or not.
This is literally a Black Mirror episode. I think it was called Nosedive. The founders were genuinely surprised by the backlash, weren't they?
They were shocked. They thought they were creating a positivity tool for character references, but the internet immediately saw it for what it was, a centralized hub for stalking and reputation destruction. The global outcry was so intense that they had to go into hiding before the app even launched. When it finally did come out, it was a neutered version where you had to opt in to be rated.
Which, of course, no one did. Because why would you give people a platform to publicly grade your personality? Oh, look, I have 3 stars for listening skills from my ex-wife. No one wants that.
The founders, Julia Cordray and Nicole McCullough, faced a literal storm of international condemnation. They were interviewed on major news networks and seemed completely baffled that people didn't want to be quantified like a burrito at Chipotle. They argued that if you're a good person, you have nothing to fear, which is the exact argument used by every surveillance state in history.
It shows a complete lack of emotional intelligence on the part of the founders. They were so focused on the data of human interaction that they ignored the dignity of it. It is a common pitfall for tech-heavy founders. They see the world as a series of APIs to be optimized rather than a collection of people with rights.
We have covered some big ones, but I want to dive into some of the more delightfully weird ones now, starting with Bodega. This was the company that wanted to replace mom-and-pop corner stores with high-tech vending machines in apartment lobbies.
The name was the biggest mistake. They called it Bodega and used a cat as the logo, a nod to the famous bodega cats of New York. It was seen as incredibly tone-deaf and culturally insensitive.
It was basically a box with a camera that used computer vision to see what you took and charged your credit card. So, a vending machine, but with more venture capital.
It raised several $1,000,000, but the PR backlash was so severe they never recovered. They changed the name to Stockwell, but then the pandemic hit. If your business model relies on people being in shared lobbies and gyms, 2020 was a bad year to exist. They folded shortly after. It is a case of disruption for the sake of disruption. No one was complaining that their local corner store was too human.
Do people really want to buy a single roll of toilet paper from a robot in their lobby? I feel like part of the bodega experience is the interaction, the sandwich guy who knows your order, the chaos of the shelves.
People actually like their local shopkeepers. Who knew? They tried to automate a relationship, and that's a hard sell. Also, the logistics were a nightmare. Who restocks the bodega boxes? You still need a human in a van driving around. So you haven't actually removed the human element, you've just hidden it and replaced a friendly face with a cold gray box. It was an efficiency play that forgot that humans aren't always looking for maximum efficiency. Sometimes we just want a bacon, egg, and cheese and a how's your day going.
Now, let's talk about my personal favorite, Yo.
Yo is the ultimate flash in the pan. It was an app where the only thing you could do was send the word yo to your friends. No text, no photos, just yo.
And it raised $1.5 million at a $10 million valuation. In 2014, I remember people thinking this was the end of civilization. The kids can't even type sentences anymore.
But wait, didn't it actually have a use case during the World Cup? I remember hearing something about that.
Yes, that was its peak. You could subscribe to a goal channel, and every time someone scored in the World Cup, your phone would just shout, "Yo!" It was the most efficient notification system ever built. What is fascinating from a technical perspective is that it actually had a lot of utility as a zero-character notification. You could use the API to have your server send a yo when a process finished, or have a smart doorbell send a yo when someone was at the gate. It was a very efficient way to send a binary signal. But as a social network, it lasted about 3 weeks before everyone got bored.
I remember the founder, or Arbel, wrote the original app in just 8 hours. It was a joke that went too far. But it actually opened up a serious conversation in the tech world about contextual communication. If I send you a yo at 8:30 a.m., it means I'm awake. If I send it at 6:30 p.m., it means are we still getting drinks? The context provides the meaning. It was brilliant in its simplicity, but it was never a business.
It was the peak of app fatigue. We were so desperate for the next big thing that we were willing to fund a single word. It is the digital equivalent of a pet rock.
Then we have Kiwi. This is the one that still hurts to think about because of the sheer scale of the waste. $1.75 billion raised. Founded by Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman, Hollywood royalty and tech royalty.
The idea was quick bites, 10-minute shows designed to be watched on your phone while you were commuting or waiting in line. They even had this turnstile technology, where the video would seamlessly switch between portrait and landscape mode.
It was an engineering marvel that solved a problem no one had. People don't mind black bars on their phone screens if the content is good, but the real killer was the timing. They launched in April 2020, right when the entire world stopped commuting.
You're stuck in your house with a 60-inch TV and a Netflix subscription, and Kiwi wants you to pay $8 a month to watch a show about a golden arm on your tiny phone screen, and you weren't even allowed to take screenshots.
That was the most boomer tech decision in history. They didn't want people making memes or sharing clips, which is how things go viral. They tried to control the user experience so tightly that they choked the life out of it. It lasted 6 months before they shut it down and sold the library to Roku for pennies on the dollar.
Is there any world where Kibi works? Like, if the pandemic didn't happen, does it survive?
Probably not, because TikTok and YouTube already owned the short form space for free. Kibi was trying to sell premium, high production value short form content to a generation that prefers raw, authentic content from creators. They were fighting the tide of how the internet actually works. It is a reminder that pedigree does not equal product market fit. You can have the best directors in the world, but if you're forcing people to consume media in a way that feels unnatural or restrictive, they will just go back to TikTok.
Let's talk about a hardware disaster that started on Kickstarter, the coolest cooler. This was a cooler that had a built-in blender, Bluetooth speakers, a USB charger, and LED lights. It raised $13 million from 60,000 backers.
It was the most funded Kickstarter ever at the time. I remember seeing the video. It was every bro dream combined into one plastic box. But feature creep is a real thing, isn't it?
It is the quirky problem on a smaller scale. They promised so much for such a low price, $185 for the early birds, that they couldn't actually manufacture it. The motor for the blender was too expensive. The shipping costs for a heavy cooler were astronomical, and they kept running into production delays. They ended up asking backers for an extra $97 just to get their coolers shipped.
That is a bold move. Hey, thanks for the millions. Can you give us more so we can actually give you the thing you bought? How did the backers react?
About as well as you'd expect. It turned into a legal nightmare. The Department of Justice got involved, there were lawsuits, and the company eventually shut down in 2019, leaving thousands of people without their blenders. It is a cautionary tale for any hardware startup. Simpler is better. Every feature you add is a new point of failure in your supply chain. If the blender broke, the whole cooler was basically trash.
And let's not forget the logistics of shipping 60,000 massive coolers. Most Kickstarter creators don't realize that shipping is a specialized skill. If you miscalculate the weight by 2 pounds and you're shipping 60,000 units, you just created $1 million hole in your budget. They were trying to be a lifestyle brand, but they were actually a logistics company that didn't know how to do logistics.
Speaking of simple, how about ship your enemies glitter?
This one is hilarious. It was a website where you could pay $10 to have an anonymous envelope full of glitter sent to someone. The Glitter Bomb.
The founder, Matt Carpenter, launched it as a joke on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, it had gone so viral that he had thousands of orders and millions of hits. He famously posted on social media, "Please stop buying this horrible glitter product. I am sick of dealing with it."
Why would he want people to stop? He was printing money.
He realized that going viral is actually a nightmare if you are a one-man operation trying to stuff envelopes with the most annoying substance on earth. His entire apartment was covered in glitter. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and he had a backlog of thousands of angry customers. He sold the site for $85,000 just a few weeks later. This is the success trap. If you don't have the infrastructure to scale, your own popularity will destroy you.
It's a great example of a micro startup. It did one thing perfectly. It captured the cultural zeitgeist for 48 hours, and then it became a liability. Matt was smart to get out when he did. The buyer, however, probably spent the next 3 years trying to get glitter out of their carpet.
We have to mention Theranos, even though it is more of a fraud than a ridiculous startup. But the central premise was certainly ambitious. A single drop of blood for hundreds of tests.
The Edison machine. It was the Juicero of healthcare. They spent years pretending they had this revolutionary microfluidic technology, when in reality they were just diluting blood samples and running them through standard Siemens machines in the back room.
What's wild to me is that they were valued at $9 billion without ever having a peer-reviewed paper or a third-party audit of their tech. It was entirely built on the aura of Elizabeth Holmes, the black turtleneck, the deep voice, the board of directors filled with former secretaries of state.
It is the ultimate example of fake it till you make it going horribly wrong. In software, if your beta crashes, people lose their saved games. In healthcare, if your beta gives a false positive for cancer, people's lives are ruined. The technical failure here was fundamental. You cannot physically get enough data out of a single drop of capillary blood to run hundreds of distinct assays accurately. The physics just don't allow for it.
And yet people wanted to believe it so badly. They wanted the Steve Jobs of medicine. It shows how desperate we are for a technological savior. We are willing to ignore the most basic scientific red flags if the narrative is compelling enough. Holmes didn't just sell a machine. She sold a vision of a world without needles.
And finally, let's talk about the shortest-lived flex in history, the I Am Rich app.
Oh man, the $999 red gem?
It was an iOS app that did nothing. It just showed a glowing red gem on your screen. It was a pure status symbol. 8 people actually bought it before Apple pulled it from the store 24 hours later.
Those 8 people are the ultimate early adopters. I have $1,000 and I want the world to know I'm willing to waste it. It is the purest expression of the App Store gold rush era. It's almost performance art.
Did they ever get their money back?
Most of them did. Apple refunded the purchases, but the developer, Armin Heinrich, reportedly made about $5,000 from the stunt after Apple took their cut. It's the ultimate low-effort, high-reward startup. No R&D, no manufacturing, no customer support. Just a JPEG of a gem and a very high price tag.
So, what are the takeaways from all this wreckage? For me, the biggest lesson is validate the problem, not the solution. Most of these companies, Juicero, Bodega, Quibi, built incredible technology for problems that didn't exist. No one was crying out for a Wi-Fi juicer or a 10-minute show they couldn't screenshot.
And unit economics are king. You can have all the venture capital in the world, but if you are losing money on every quick bite or every cooler, you are just accelerating your own demise. You cannot subsidize your way into a profitable business model if the fundamental math doesn't work.
I also think there's a lesson in respecting the atoms. Hardware is hard. Quirky and the coolest cooler found out that physical logistics and manufacturing are a completely different beast than writing code. You can't A/B test a plastic mold that cost $50,000 to create.
For our listeners who are thinking about joining a startup or investing in one, I'd suggest a pre-mortem analysis. Imagine it is 3 years from now and the company has failed. Why did it fail? Usually, the answer is right there in the pitch deck if you look hard enough. Is it a solution looking for a problem? Is it fighting the laws of physics? Or is it ignoring human nature?
If the answer is all of the above, you might be looking at the next Juicero, or worse, the next Theranos. It's important to remember that just because a founder is charismatic and has a lot of money doesn't mean they have a viable business. In fact, sometimes the more money they have, the less they are forced to confront the reality of their product.
Well, this has been a trip down memory lane. I'm going to go squeeze an orange with my hands just to feel alive. I don't need 4 tons of pressure to enjoy my breakfast.
And I'm going to go send a yo to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop. Thanks for putting this together, Hilbert. I hope it doesn't annoy you too much.
Big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that powered this show. If you're building the next great and hopefully not ridiculous startup, check them out for your serverless GPU needs. They won't make you buy a $700 juicer.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying our deep dives into tech history and absurdity, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us out. It's the only way we know people are actually listening and not just yoing us.
Catch us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive. See you next time. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.